All eyes turned to see an elderly waitress, her hands trembling, standing frozen with shock and embarrassment. Across from her, Barron Trump wiped his shirt, his face unreadable. The entire cafe held its breath, waiting to see his reaction. But what he did next left everyone speechless. The cafe buzzed with quiet energy, a mix of gentle conversation, the clinking of plates, and the hiss of the espresso machine. The warm aroma of freshly brewed coffee and baked pastries filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of rain drifting in through the propped-open door. Golden sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting soft patterns across the wooden floors and giving the small space a cozy, welcoming glow. At one corner of the cafe, an elderly waitress moved carefully between tables, her worn sneakers squeaking faintly against the floor. She was dressed in a faded uniform, its pockets slightly frayed, and an apron that had clearly seen better days. Her face carried lines of experience, her kind eyes betraying a hint of weariness. Despite her age and the physical toll of the job, she managed to greet each customer with a polite, practiced smile. At a table near the window sat Barron Trump, dressed casually in a simple hoodie and jeans. He was flipping through a book, his tall frame hunched slightly over the table. To most, he appeared just like any other young man seeking a moment of quiet amidst the hum of daily life. Yet, there was an air about him, something calm and composed that seemed to subtly command attention. The chatter in the cafe ebbed and flowed as the waitress approached Barron's table, balancing a tray laden with steaming coffee cups. Her steps were careful, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her exhaustion. The faintest wobble in the tray went unnoticed by the other patrons, who continued sipping their drinks and scrolling through their phones. But in that serene moment, something was about to shift. The stage was set, the air growing heavy with anticipation. In just a few seconds, everything would change. The moment unfolded in slow motion. The elderly waitress, balancing the tray with a trembling hand, took one careful step too many. A subtle misstep caused her weight to shift, and in an instant, the tray tipped. The contents, a steaming cup of coffee, a small saucer, and a delicate china plate, tumbled forward, gravity pulling them to the ground. The coffee didn't just splash on the floor. It landed squarely on Barron Trump's hoodie, soaking the front and spilling onto the table. The cup shattered with a loud clink, scattering shards across the polished wooden floor. Gasps rippled through the cafe as customers turned to see the source of the commotion. The waitress froze, her face pale with shock. Her trembling hands flew to her mouth, and for a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Her eyes darted between the spilled coffee, the broken cup, and Barron, who was now standing to assess the damage. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice cracking with panic. Barron looked down at his soaked hoodie, his expression calm but unreadable. Around them, the room buzzed with murmurs. Some patrons whispered to each other, their curiosity piqued. Others stared openly, waiting to see how he would respond. The waitress, overwhelmed with embarrassment, crouched down to pick up the broken pieces of the cup. Her hands shook as she fumbled with the shards. Her face flushed with humiliation. "Please, let me clean this up," she said hurriedly, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll cover the cost of your drink. I didn't mean to." "Careful," Barron interrupted, his tone steady but firm. He knelt beside her, gently taking the larger pieces from her hands before she could cut herself. "You'll hurt yourself if you're not careful." The waitress blinked up at him, her eyes wide with surprise. I'm so sorry," she repeated, her voice breaking. "It's my fault. I wasn't paying attention." The tension in the cafe was thick. A few patrons exchanged glances, some amused by the drama, others visibly concerned for the waitress. One customer muttered, "Betty's going to make a scene." Another leaned toward their companion, whispering, "He's not going to let that slide." Barron didn't react to the chatter. He stood up slowly, setting the broken pieces on the tray and offering his hand to the waitress. "It's okay," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "Accidents happen." She hesitated, her face filled with doubt, before finally accepting his help. "I can pay for dry cleaning. she offered nervously. "I don't want you to think. You don't need to do that," Barron said firmly, cutting her off. "Really, it's fine." The waitress's lips trembled as she tried to hold back tears. She was no stranger to difficult customers. She had faced angry rants and harsh words before, but this reaction? It wasn't what she expected. And neither did anyone else in the cafe. The onlookers, who had been waiting for a dramatic outburst, suddenly found themselves leaning in closer, curious to see what would happen next. The conflict wasn't about the spilled coffee anymore. It was about how one small act of kindness in the face of a mistake could change the mood of an entire room. The cafe was unnervingly quiet, save for the faint clink of broken porcelain as Barron carefully placed the shards back onto the tray. The elderly waitress, her hands still trembling, shifted uncomfortably on her knees as she tried to gather the remnants of her mistake. A soft hum of whispers began to rise from the onlookers. "Did you see that? He's not even mad," someone murmured from a nearby table. Barron looked down at the waitress and spoke gently. "Let me help." He crouched again, brushing aside a few remaining shards with a napkin to ensure they wouldn't hurt anyone. His voice was calm, steady, and remarkably unshaken. The waitress, overwhelmed, shook her head vigorously. "No, no, please, you shouldn't. It's my mess. I'll clean it up." Her words were quick, frantic, and filled with guilt. "You don't have to do this." "I insist," Barron replied, standing to his full height and signaling to one of the staff behind the counter. "Can we get a broom over here?" His tone carried no frustration, only clarity. The barista, a young man who had been watching the scene unfold with wide eyes, snapped to attention. Yeah, right away," he stammered, disappearing into the back to fetch the cleaning supplies. Barron turned back to the waitress, offering her his hand once more. "Why don't you sit for a moment? You've been working hard. I'll handle this." The entire cafe seemed to collectively exhale, but the tension shifted. People weren't whispering out of judgment anymore. They were intrigued. Customers leaned closer to one another, their curiosity piqued by Barron's composed demeanor. A woman at a nearby table whispered, "I expected him to yell or demand a refund. What's he doing?" Another man chimed in, "I've seen people lose it over way less. Who is this guy?" As the waitress reluctantly allowed Barron to help her to her feet, her voice cracked again. "I've been on my feet all day. I didn't mean to." Her words caught in her throat, and she covered her face, clearly trying to hold back tears. Barron gave her a reassuring smile. "It's just coffee," he said simply. "You're okay, and that's what matters." This simple statement seemed to ripple through the room, silencing even the faintest murmurs. The waitress looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with gratitude. "You don't understand," she said softly. "People aren't usually this kind." Barron tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "Well, maybe they should be." Meanwhile, the barista returned with a broom and dustpan, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Here, let me take care of that," he said, moving quickly to clean up the mess. Barron stepped back to let him work, but stayed close to the waitress, who was now clutching the edge of a nearby table for support. The barista glanced up at Barron as he swept the floor. I didn't know it was you," he mumbled, clearly recognizing him now. "Most people would have, reacted differently." Barron smiled faintly but didn't respond, choosing instead to turn his attention back to the waitress. "How long have you worked here?" he asked gently, shifting the conversation away from himself. "Too long," she admitted with a nervous chuckle. "I've been here nearly 10 years. I thought it would be temporary, but life has a way of keeping you where you don't expect to stay." Barron nodded, his gaze steady. "It sounds like you've worked hard. You deserve more credit than you give yourself." Her lips quivered again, and she looked down at her worn shoes. "It's just a job," she muttered, though her tone betrayed how much it weighed on her. "People don't usually notice." "Well, I do," Barron said firmly, "and I think a lot of people here do now too." He gestured subtly toward the patrons, who were watching the interaction with newfound respect. The cafe patrons began to shift in their seats. A young woman at the corner table quietly approached the waitress and placed a folded bill in her hand. "For you," she said with a kind smile, "you deserve a break." The waitress stared at the bill, her hands shaking as she clutched it to her chest. I can't take this, she protested weakly, but the young woman shook her head and returned to her seat. The gesture seemed to spark a ripple effect. A man near the counter added a tip to the jar, nodding toward the waitress as he did. Another customer approached the barista, whispering that they wanted to pay for the waitress's next meal. The room began to hum with quiet acts of kindness, all inspired by the unexpected way Barron had responded. Barron stood quietly amidst the movement, his presence unassuming but magnetic. He wasn't making speeches or drawing attention to himself, yet his actions spoke louder than words. The waitress looked up at him, her voice trembling. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said. "Sometimes," Barron replied. "We just need someone to remind us that mistakes don't define us. How we handle them does." The waitress wiped her eyes, a small, grateful smile forming on her lips. For the first time that day, she stood a little taller. The tension in the room had dissolved entirely, replaced by a warm, shared understanding, and all of it had started with a spilled cup of coffee. As the cafe settled into a new hum of warmth and quiet conversation, the waitress, still overwhelmed by the unexpected kindness of the patrons, turned to Barron. Her voice was steadier now, though a hint of vulnerability remained. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done," she said softly. "People don't usually notice someone like me, let alone help." Barron smiled gently, shaking his head. "You've been helping everyone who walks through that door for years," he replied. "It's about time someone noticed." The waitress paused, as if weighing whether to say what was on her mind. Finally, she took a deep breath and said, "You remind me of my son." Her voice faltered, and she looked down at her hands, which were worn from years of work. "He used to say things like that. Before he passed." The cafe seemed still again, her quiet words rippling through the room like a stone dropped into calm water. Barron's expression softened, and he didn't rush to speak, allowing her to continue. "He was the kindest person I knew," she said, her lips trembling. "Always saw the good in people, no matter what. When I lost him, I didn't think I could keep going, but I had to, because that's what he would have wanted." She looked up, her eyes glassy but determined. "Sometimes I wonder if anyone notices how hard I've tried, and then someone like you comes along and reminds me that maybe it's worth it." Barron's gaze didn't waver. "It is," he said simply, "and you've made a bigger difference than you realize." Her shoulders relaxed slightly, and a faint, genuine smile broke through her grief. The small crowd of patrons, many of whom had been pretending not to eavesdrop, now looked on with quiet respect. A few even wiped away tears, clearly moved by the exchange. Then something unexpected happened. A young woman at a nearby table spoke up, her voice hesitant but clear. "I lost someone too," she said, looking at the waitress. "And I know how hard it can be to keep going, but seeing you here, still smiling, still working so hard, it's inspiring." And for a moment she seemed lost for words. "Thank you," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Another customer chimed in, a man seated by the window. "We don't say it often enough, but people like you keep the world running. It's not just coffee you serve. It's kindness, patience, and care." The cafe buzzed with quiet agreement, small nods and murmurs of affirmation spreading like a wave. The barista behind the counter, who had been watching the entire exchange, stepped forward. "You've always been the heart of this place," he said to the waitress, his voice filled with emotion. "We'd all be lost without you." The waitress's face flushed with emotion, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I don't know what to say," she stammered. Barron stepped closer, his tone as steady as ever. "Sometimes all it takes is one small moment to remind us how much we matter. You've spent your life giving to others. Let us give a little back to you." In that instant, something shifted in the room, a shared understanding of the quiet struggles we all carry and the power of kindness to lighten those burdens. The waitress stood taller, her smile more certain, as if she had been given permission to believe in herself again. And as Barron returned to his seat, the room felt brighter, warmer, and undeniably changed. What had started with a spilled cup of coffee had become a moment none of them would forget. A moment of connection, compassion, and hope. The cafe was no longer just a coffee shop. It had become a space brimming with warmth and connection. The waitress stood near the counter, her eyes shining with gratitude as she looked at Barron. She seemed lighter now, as though a weight she'd been carrying for years had been lifted, if only for a moment. Around her, the other patrons began to act on the energy of the moment. The young woman who had spoken earlier approached her again. "I just wanted to say, you remind me of my mom," she said, her voice soft but steady. "She works so hard, just like you. And I never told her how much I appreciated her. But you deserve to hear it. You're amazing." The waitress's lips trembled as she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. "You don't know how much that means to me." Nearby, the man who had tipped generously earlier spoke up. "It's not just about the coffee," he said, addressing the room as much as the waitress. "It's the way you treat people. Every time I come in here, you make it feel like home. That's rare, and it's worth celebrating." The words hung in the air, their sincerity drawing nods and murmurs of agreement from the other customers. The waitress looked around, clearly overwhelmed by the outpouring of kindness. She wiped her hands on her apron, her smile growing wider as she began to understand just how much she meant to these people. Barron, who had quietly returned to his seat, observed the scene with a small, satisfied smile. The ripple effect of his calm response to the spilled coffee had transformed not just the waitress's day, but the entire atmosphere of the cafe. It was a shift in how people saw each other, even for a moment. The barista, who had been quietly watching from behind the counter, stepped forward with a freshly brewed cup of coffee. "This one's on me," he said to the waitress, his voice tinged with emotion. "You deserve a break." The waitress accepted the cup with shaky hands, her smile now radiating joy. "Thank you," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "I don't even know how to thank all of you." "To the best waitress in town," he said, and the room followed suit, lifting their drinks in a quiet but heartfelt gesture of appreciation. Barron, sensing that the moment was hers to own, prepared to leave. He stood and walked toward the counter, catching the waitress's attention. "You're stronger than you know," he said simply. "Don't ever forget that." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I won't," she promised, her voice steady now. "And thank you for everything." As Barron exited the cafe, the room felt different, warmer, more connected, as though everyone present had been reminded of something important, that kindness, no matter how small, has the power to change lives. The waitress stood by the counter, holding her coffee, no longer just a tired worker, but someone who had rediscovered her worth. And as the door closed behind Barron, the quiet hum of conversation resumed, but the glow of the moment lingered in every corner of the room. This story is a powerful reminder of the ripple effect kindness can have. A spilled cup of coffee, a moment that could have been met with anger or frustration, became the spark for something much greater. Instead of reacting with hostility, Barron Trump chose empathy and understanding. That one decision didn't just ease the waitress's guilt, it inspired an entire room to see her in a new light. We often underestimate the impact of our actions, especially in small, seemingly unimportant moments. But this story shows how compassion can turn even a mistake into an opportunity for connection and growth. The elderly waitress, who spent her days quietly serving others, finally felt seen, valued, and appreciated. All because one person chose kindness over judgment. In life, we all face moments where things don't go as planned. How we respond in those moments can define not just who we are, but the environment we create around us. Choosing patience and understanding can transform a bad situation into something meaningful. The lesson is clear. Small acts of kindness can have profound effects, often in ways we don't immediately see. They remind us that we all carry unseen struggles, and that showing grace to one another can create a brighter, more compassionate world. Let this story inspire us all to look for opportunities to uplift others, no matter how small they may seem. If this story inspired you, take a moment to share it with someone who could use a little reminder about the power of kindness and understanding. Small acts can make a big difference, just like they did here. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that remind us of the good in the world. Let's spread a little more positivity, one story at a time.